Beneath calm coastlines, sudden violence erupts in bursts of foam, leaving even skilled swimmers and seasoned crews scrambling for survival. Silent shadows rise without warning, turning routine dives and simple ocean stunts into desperate fights against unseen power. From a fatal film shoot in Gansbai to a kiteboarder ambushed mid-air, the danger is unforgettable. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters. October 21, 2025. The coastal waters off Gansbai, South Africa, stretched cold and gray beneath an overcast sky. The town, perched on the southern tip of the African continent, had earned its reputation as one of the world's most reliable spots for great white shark sightings. The waters here formed part of a natural corridor where massive predators patrolled the depths, drawn by the dense populations of Cape Fur seals that clustered on nearby rocks and islands. The area's nickname, Shark Alley, was no marketing gimmick. Every year, researchers documented dozens of great whites hunting these waters, their dorsal fins cutting through the surface like dark promises of the power lurking below. Liam Brooks, a 32-year-old actor from Wellington, New Zealand, stood on the deck of a modified fishing vessel that morning, adjusting the straps on his wetsuit. He had been hired 3 months earlier for a supporting role in a big-budget action thriller, the kind of film that promised explosions, chase sequences, and stunts that would make audiences gasp. The production company had flown him to South Africa specifically for this sequence, a dramatic plunge from coastal rocks into churning surf that would serve as the opening scene. Liam had spent years doing his own stunts, building a reputation as someone willing to take risks that made directors' jobs easier and insurance companies nervous. The director, a compact Englishman named Gerald, had scouted this particular stretch of coastline because it offered the raw, untamed aesthetic the script demanded. Jagged rocks jutted from the water like broken teeth, and the swell rolled in with enough force to create the white foam and dramatic spray the cameras needed. What made the location even more appealing to Gerald was its authenticity. This was genuine shark territory, and while the production would never deliberately film the animals, their presence in the area added a layer of real danger that he believed would translate through the lens. The crew had arrived at dawn, unloading equipment from 2 vehicles parked on the clifftop. A marine coordinator named Peter, a weather-beaten South African who had worked these waters for 15 years, had been hired to advise on ocean conditions. He had expressed concerns during the previous day's briefing, noting that seal activity had been unusually high that week, which typically meant increased shark presence. Several fishermen had reported sightings of large great whites cruising close to shore, their dark shapes visible even from the cliffs above. Gerald had listened to Peter's warnings but ultimately decided to proceed. The weather window was tight, the production schedule unforgiving, and the shot would take less than 10 minutes to capture. Liam would make the jump, the cameras would roll, and they would extract him quickly via the rigid inflatable boat bobbing 50 meters offshore. By mid-morning, everything was in position. 2 cameras had been mounted on the rocks, their operators secured by climbing harnesses. A 3rd camera sat aboard the boat, operated by a Danish cinematographer named Henrik, who specialized in marine footage. The boat's engine idled, its skipper keeping the vessel steady against the current's pull. Liam had completed 2 practice runs, climbing down to the designated jump point and reviewing the trajectory with Gerald, who shouted directions through a megaphone from a safer vantage point above. The water temperature registered 14 degrees Celsius. Liam zipped his wetsuit all the way and pulled on neoprene gloves, the cold already seeping through the material. He positioned himself on the rock ledge, his toes curling over the edge, watching the swells rise and fall below. The ocean here never truly calmed. It breathed with a constant rhythm that could shift from manageable to violent within seconds. Gerald's voice crackled over the radio that Peter held. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. Jump. Liam launched himself forward, his body arcing through the air in the spread eagle pose the director wanted. The cameras captured every frame as he dropped 12 feet, his body slicing into the cold water with force enough to knock the air from his lungs momentarily. The impact stunned him briefly, the cold seizing his chest muscles. He kicked hard, orienting himself to swim the 30 meters toward the boat where Henrik waited, camera still rolling. But the ocean below held something else. The great white had been patrolling this section for the better part of an hour, drawn by the commotion from the seal colony 200 meters to the west. At 17 feet long and weighing close to 2,000 kilograms, the shark was a mature female, scarred from decades of hunting and territorial disputes. The splash from Liam's entry registered as a surface disturbance, the kind that often indicated a wounded seal or disoriented prey. The shark accelerated from 20 feet below, its powerful tail propelling it upward with terrifying speed. It struck Liam from beneath, its jaws clamping around his torso just below the ribcage. The teeth, serrated and curved, punched through the wetsuit and into flesh with hydraulic force. Liam's scream was cut short as the shark dragged him under, shaking its massive head in the instinctive thrashing motion that great whites used to tear chunks from large prey. From the boat, Henrik saw only the explosion of white water and the sudden absence of Liam's head above the surface. He shouted to the skipper, who throttled the engine forward. Peter grabbed an aluminum pole kept aboard specifically for shark deterrence, while another crew member lit 2 marine flares. The shark released Liam momentarily, perhaps confused by the lack of blubber or the unfamiliar taste of neoprene and human tissue. Liam surfaced, gasping, his arms flailing. Blood spread rapidly through the water, dark clouds expanding in the current. The shark circled once, then struck again, this time clamping onto his upper thigh. The predator pulled him downward, and the water boiled red. Peter leaned over the gunwale, thrusting the pole toward the shark's head, but the animal was too deep, too committed to its attack. Henrik continued filming, his professional instincts overriding the horror unfolding through his lens. The skipper brought the boat dangerously close to the attack site, close enough that the crew could see the shark's gray dorsal fin break the surface, its body twisting as it held Liam, still clamped in its jaws. The Marine coordinator threw both flares into the water, the bright magnesium sparks hissing against the ocean. The shark, startled by the sudden light and noise, released its grip a second time. Liam's body floated limply, face down, the water around him now completely opaque with blood. 2 crew members dove in with a rescue buoy, dragging Liam's body toward the boat while Peter scanned the water for the shark's return. The predator had descended again, its silhouette visible perhaps 10 feet below, circling slowly. The crew hauled Liam aboard with desperate urgency, his wetsuit shredded, deep lacerations visible across his torso and thigh. His face was pale, his lips blue, and no breath escaping his mouth. Peter began CPR immediately while the skipper radioed for emergency medical evacuation. The boat roared toward shore, crashing through the swells, every second measured against Liam's fading pulse. By the time they reached the small harbor 5 kilometers south, paramedics were waiting. But the blood loss had been catastrophic. The shark's teeth had severed major arteries, and the secondary attack had caused massive internal trauma. Liam Brooks was pronounced dead at the scene, 28 minutes after he had jumped from the rock. The production shut down immediately. Gerald sat in his hotel room that evening, staring at the footage Henrik had captured, the attack visible in horrifying clarity. The film would never be released. The sequence would never be used. Peter gave multiple statements to authorities investigating the incident, emphasizing the warnings he had issued and the known risks of filming in active predator territory. The great white was never located or identified after the attack, simply another apex predator doing what millions of years of evolution had designed it to do. Liam's family released a statement 3 days later, requesting privacy and noting that he had died doing what he loved, though the words rang hollow against the senselessness of it all. April 11, 2025. The waters off Ningaloo Reef on Australia's western coast shimmered under the late afternoon sun, the light filtering through in golden shafts that illuminated the coral gardens below. This section of coastline, stretching over 300 kilometers, was renowned for its exceptional marine biodiversity and crystal-clear visibility that often exceeded 40 meters. The reef system attracted divers from across the globe, drawn by the promise of encountering manta rays, whale sharks, and countless species of tropical fish that thrived in the warm Indian Ocean currents. Elena Vargas, a 32-year-old underwater photographer from Barcelona, had spent the past week documenting marine life along the reef's outer edges. She had built a modest career selling her work to nature magazines and conservation organizations. Her portfolio, featuring striking images of underwater ecosystems that most people would never witness firsthand. On this particular afternoon, she had convinced her dive partner, a local guide named Marcus, to explore a partially submerged cargo vessel that had run aground during a cyclone in 1979. The wreck, sitting in 18 meters of water, had transformed over the decades into an artificial reef, its rusted skeleton now home to schools of fish and encrusted with coral. They descended the anchor line just after 4 in the afternoon, the sun already beginning its descent toward the horizon. Elena carried her camera housing, a bulky waterproof case that protected her expensive equipment, while Marcus brought only his basic dive gear and a small knife strapped to his calf. The wreck loomed below them, its hull broken open in several places, creating dark passages that looked both inviting and ominous. Elena finalized her shots of a school of batfish swirling around the wreck's mast, then gestured to Marcus that she wanted to explore the cargo hold. He nodded, following her through a wide breach in the hull where metal plates had peeled back like torn paper. Inside, the light dimmed considerably, filtered through the narrow openings and gaps in the structure. Small fish darted through the corridors, and Elena paused frequently to frame her shots, her flash strobing in the gloom. She positioned herself near a section of railing, leaning over to capture an angle of sunlight cutting through the wreckage. Her fins stirred sediment from the deck, clouding the water momentarily. She didn't notice the tiger shark until it was almost upon her. The 14-foot predator had been resting in a chamber deeper within the wreck, drawn there by trevally that often sheltered in the shadows. Elena's movements and the disturbed sediment had triggered its curiosity, or perhaps something more instinctive. The shark moved with startling speed through the confined space, its distinctive stripes visible even in the reduced light. It clamped onto Elena's lower left leg just above the ankle, its teeth punching through the thin neoprene of her wetsuit. Pain exploded through her nervous system, sharp and immediate. She screamed into her regulator, the sound emerging as muffled bubbles. Instinct took over. She kicked violently with her free leg, connecting with the shark's snout, while her hands grabbed desperately for the metal railing beside her. Marcus saw the attack unfold and reacted immediately, swimming forward and slamming his camera housing repeatedly against the water near the shark's head. The impacts created pressure waves and noise that confused the predator. The tiger shark held on for perhaps 6 or 7 seconds, then released its grip and retreated backward through the wreck's corridor, disappearing into the darker recesses. Blood poured from the puncture wounds in Elena's leg, streaming upward in the water like dark ribbons. Marcus grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the exit, both of them kicking hard despite the pain radiating through Elena's injured limb. They ascended faster than was strictly safe, both understanding that staying near the wreck with blood in the water was far more dangerous than risking decompression issues. They broke the surface 70 meters from their dive boat, waving frantically. The boat's captain saw them immediately and brought the vessel alongside within 2 minutes. Marcus and another crew member hauled Elena aboard, her leg bleeding profusely from multiple deep puncture wounds where the shark's teeth had penetrated. The captain applied pressure with towels while radiating ahead to the harbor, requesting ambulance response. Elena remained conscious throughout the ordeal, her face pale but her voice steady as she described what had happened. The boat reached shore 18 minutes after the attack, and paramedics transported her to the regional hospital, where surgeons cleaned and sutured the wounds. She survived with permanent scarring and nerve damage that left her with a slight limp. Marine experts who reviewed the incident noted that tiger sharks, while generally cautious in open water, could become more aggressive in confined wreck environments where escape routes were limited, and sudden movements triggered defensive strikes. Elena never dove the wreck again, but continued her photography work in open water, always with heightened awareness of her surroundings. July 22, 2019. The Brisbane River wound through the heart of Queensland's capital city, a murky brown waterway that had served as the region's primary artery since European settlement in the 1820s. The river stretched over 300 kilometers from its source in the mountains to its mouth at Moreton Bay, passing through urban sprawl, industrial zones, and pockets of mangrove forest clinging to its banks. Heavy rainfall had pummeled the region for 5 consecutive days that week, swelling the river beyond its normal levels and turning the water into a churning soup of sediment, debris, and runoff from upstream tributaries. Connor Hayes, a 32-year-old environmental consultant from Newcastle, had driven to Brisbane for a work conference that had concluded the previous afternoon. Rather than fly home immediately, he decided to spend an extra day exploring the river's upper reaches, where residential development gave way to bushland, and the water took on a more wild character. Connor had kayaked since his university days, drawn to the meditative rhythm of paddling and the access it provided to areas unreachable by foot or vehicle. He launched his kayak from a public boat ramp in the northern suburbs around 11 in the morning, the water high and fast from the recent rains. The current pulled strongly, and Connor had to work harder than expected to maintain his course as he paddled upstream, his shoulders burning from the effort. The sky remained overcast, threatening more rain, and the water's surface rippled with wind and current, making it impossible to see more than a few centimeters below. What Connor didn't know was that bull sharks regularly patrolled this section of the river, particularly after heavy rains when the water's salinity dropped and the turbulent conditions concealed their movements. Bull sharks possessed a rare adaptation among their species. capable of tolerating fresh water for extended periods, allowing them to venture far upstream in river systems across their range. The Brisbane River hosted a resident population that authorities had documented for decades, though attacks remained rare enough that most recreational users gave the danger little consideration. Connor maneuvered around a large submerged log that had washed downstream during the floods, its branches creating a partial dam that diverted the current. He planted his paddle to push away from the obstacle, his kayak tilting slightly as he adjusted his weight. The movement created vibrations through the water, the kind of irregular disturbance that attracted predators hunting in poor visibility. The bull shark struck from directly below, exploding upward with enough force to lift the kayak partially. Its jaws clamped onto Connor's right thigh, the teeth sinking deep through his board shorts and into the muscle beneath. Connor screamed, his paddle falling from his hands as he instinctively grabbed at the shark's head, his fingers finding only slick, sandpaper-rough skin. The predator was massive, easily 10 feet long and weighing close to 200 kilograms. The shark pulled downward with tremendous force, dragging Connor from the kayak and into the turbulent water. He kicked frantically with his free leg, trying to find purchase against something, anything. But there was only water and the relentless pressure of the shark's bite. The animal thrashed its head side to side, the motion tearing through muscle and severing major blood vessels in Connor's thigh. The water around them turned dark with blood, though the river's natural murkiness made it difficult to distinguish where the sediment ended and the hemorrhaging began. Two of Connor's friends had been fishing from the bank about 40 meters downstream, having arranged to meet him at this spot for lunch. They heard his scream and saw his kayak spinning empty in the current. One of them, a mechanic named Trevor, immediately waded into the shallows shouting Connor's name. The other friend called emergency services, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped his phone. Connor surfaced briefly, his face contorted in agony, gasping for air before the shark pulled him under again. The predator struck a second time, clamping onto his hip and lower abdomen, its feeding instinct fully engaged now. Trevor threw rocks and branches into the water, trying desperately to create enough disturbance to drive the shark away. But the animal was beyond distraction, focused entirely on its prey. A kayaker from further upstream, a woman named Patricia, saw the commotion and paddled frantically toward the scene. She arrived to find Connor's body floating face down in the current, the shark having finally released him and disappeared into the deeper channel. Patricia grabbed Connor's arm and tried to pull him toward shore, but the current fought against her efforts, and his weight was too much to manage alone. Trevor waded deeper, now chest deep in the murky water despite the obvious danger, and together they hauled Connor onto a muddy section of bank. Connor's injuries were catastrophic. The shark's first bite had severed his femoral artery, and the second attack had caused massive trauma to his pelvis and lower organs. Trevor attempted to apply pressure to the leg wound with his shirt, but the blood loss had already been too severe. Connor's breathing was shallow and irregular, his eyes unfocused. He spoke no words, made no sounds beyond labored gasps. Paramedics arrived 11 minutes after the initial call, navigating narrow access roads to reach the riverbank. They worked on Connor for 18 minutes, establishing IV lines and attempting to stabilize his blood pressure, but he had lost consciousness within 3 minutes of being pulled from the water. He was pronounced dead at the scene, roughly 25 minutes after the initial attack. Authorities closed that section of the river for 3 days following the incident and posted warnings about bull shark activity. Marine biologists who investigated noted that flood conditions created perfect hunting scenarios for the predators, where human activity intersected with aggressive territorial behavior in waters that offered the sharks complete concealment. Connor's death marked the third fatal bull shark attack in Queensland rivers in 7 years, a grim reminder that these waterways, despite their urban proximity, remained genuinely wild spaces where apex predators still ruled. November 8, 2022. The coastal waters off Gansby, South Africa, rolled beneath a late afternoon sky streaked with orange and purple as the sun descended toward the horizon. This stretch of ocean, positioned along the southern tip of the African continent, had earned its reputation as one of the world's premier great white shark habitats. The cold Atlantic currents mixed with warmer Indian Ocean waters here, creating nutrient-rich conditions that supported massive populations of Cape fur seals, which in turn attracted the apex predators that hunted them with lethal efficiency. Clara and James Whitman, both 30 years old and married just 2 weeks earlier in Surrey, had chartered a 40-foot yacht for their honeymoon, wanting something more adventurous than the typical resort vacation. The vessel came with a skipper named Dion, a weathered South African who had sailed these waters for 20 years and knew their moods and dangers intimately. He had anchored the yacht about 2 kilometers offshore that afternoon, positioning it near a rocky outcrop where seals frequently congregated, but warning the couple not to swim in the area. James had dismissed the warning with the confidence of someone who had grown up swimming in the English Channel and considered himself comfortable in challenging conditions. Clara had been more hesitant, but ultimately agreed when James suggested a quick swim from the yacht's stern platform. The water temperature registered around 15 degrees Celsius, cold enough to take their breath away, but manageable for a brief dip. They entered the water around 5:30 in the afternoon, just as the sun's angle created long shadows across the surface. Deon remained aboard, monitoring them from the deck while preparing dinner below. The yacht rocked gently in the swell, its anchor chain creaking against the current's pull. James had been in the water perhaps 90 seconds when the great white struck. The shark, a massive female measuring nearly 17 feet, had been patrolling the area for the past hour, tracking the seal colony's movements. The splash and erratic movements of the humans in the water registered as potential prey, the kind of surface disturbance that triggered the shark's hunting instincts. The predator exploded upward from 20 feet below, its jaws opening wide as it targeted James's legs. The teeth clamped onto his right calf and thigh, and the shark's momentum drove him completely underwater. Clara, floating 3 meters away, saw only the eruption of white water and her husband's sudden disappearance beneath the surface. She screamed, the sound cutting across the water. The shark thrashed violently, shaking James like a seal, its serrated teeth tearing through the flesh of his leg. Blood clouded the water immediately, dark streams spreading through the swell. James fought instinctively, punching at the shark's snout with his fists, the impacts doing little against the animal's thick skin and cartilage. Deon heard Clara's scream and rushed to the stern, immediately understanding what was happening. He grabbed boat fenders, paddles, and a life ring, throwing them toward the attack site while shouting instructions to Clara to swim back to the yacht. The debris hitting the water created enough disturbance to confuse the shark momentarily. The great white released James and circled once, its dorsal fin cutting the surface in a wide arc. James surfaced, gasping and flailing, blood pouring from his mangled leg. Clara, despite the terror, swam toward him rather than the yacht, grabbing his arm and trying to pull him toward safety. The shark circled again, closer this time, and Deon threw more fenders and began beating a paddle against the yacht's hull, creating rhythmic impacts that reverberated through the water. The noise seemed to deter the predator. It descended again, its massive shadow visible beneath the surface for another 30 seconds, before it disappeared entirely into deeper water. Deon threw a rescue line and Clara looped it under James's arms. Together they hauled him aboard, his legs shredded from mid-thigh to ankle, deep lacerations exposing muscle and bone. His femur had fractured from the bite pressure, and several arteries had been severed. Deon applied tourniquets above the knee while radioing for emergency evacuation. A helicopter arrived 40 minutes later, winching James directly from the yacht's deck while Clara held his hand, her own body shaking from shock and hypothermia. James survived after emergency surgery at a trauma center, though his leg required multiple reconstructive procedures and he retained permanent nerve damage. Clara suffered severe psychological trauma and nightmares that persisted for months afterward, the image of her husband being dragged underwater replaying endlessly in her mind. October 5, 2021. The waters of Bahia de La Paz in Baja California, Mexico, stretched calm and glassy under the early morning sun, the surface reflecting the desert mountains that rose sharply from the eastern shore. This region, positioned where the Sea of Cortez met the Pacific Ocean, had developed a reputation among marine biologists as one of the most biodiverse areas in the Western Hemisphere. The nutrient-rich current supported everything from microscopic plankton to massive whale sharks, creating an ecosystem that attracted researchers and tourists alike. Mateo Rojas, a 34-year-old graphic designer from Guadalajara, had driven to La Paz specifically to spend a week paddleboarding in the protected bays that dotted the coastline. He had been practicing the sport for 3 years, drawn to its meditative quality and the unique perspective it offered on marine life. On this particular morning, he launched his board from a public beach around 6:30, wanting to catch the sunrise and observe the wildlife that became active in the cooler hours. The bay remained quiet except for the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface and the distant calls of pelicans diving for their breakfast. Mateo paddled smoothly, his strokes efficient and practiced, moving parallel to shore about 200 meters out. The water depth here ranged from 4 to 8 meters, shallow enough that sunlight illuminated the sandy bottom and occasional patches of seagrass that swayed with the gentle current. What Mateo didn't realize was that a 12-foot scalloped hammerhead had been patrolling this section of bay for the past 20 minutes, its distinctive head sweeping side to side as it used its widely spaced sensory organs to detect prey buried in the sand. Hammerhead sharks, despite their intimidating appearance, rarely pose a threat to humans. They primarily eat stingrays, small fish, and crustaceans. However, they could become defensive when startled or provoked, particularly in shallow water where they felt confined. Mateo paused to adjust his position, shifting his weight to kneel on the board for a moment of rest. As he did, his paddle slipped from his grip and splashed into the water beside the board. He reached down quickly to retrieve it, his hand breaking the surface just above where the hammerhead was passing beneath. The shark reacted instantly to the sudden disturbance, perceiving it as either a threat or potential prey. It turned sharply upward and clamped its jaws onto Mateo's right ankle, the teeth sinking through his skin and into the soft tissue beneath. The pain was immediate and intense, like being caught in a bear trap. Mateo shouted and kicked reflexively with his free leg, connecting with the shark's flank. The hammerhead held on for perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, thrashing its head in the characteristic motion that sharks use to tear flesh. Blood spread quickly through the clear water, and Mateo could see the distinctive hammer-shaped head through the surface as the shark maintained its grip. He struck downward with his paddle, the blade connecting with the water near the shark's eye, creating enough pressure and noise to startle the animal. The hammerhead released him and retreated, descending rapidly toward the bottom before swimming away parallel to shore. Mateo pulled himself fully onto the board, his ankle bleeding heavily from multiple puncture wounds where the teeth had penetrated. The scars were deep, but hadn't severed any major vessels, though the pain was excruciating. 2 kayakers from a nearby tour group had witnessed the attack and paddled quickly toward him, one of them radioing their base for assistance. They helped stabilize Mateo on his board and towed him back toward shore, maintaining pressure on his ankle with a spare shirt. The guide, a woman named Isabella who had worked the bay for 6 years, explained that hammerheads occasionally patrolled these shallows, but attacks were virtually unheard of. Mateo reached shore 12 minutes after the bite, and paramedics who had been stationed at a nearby resort arrived within 5 minutes. They cleaned and bandaged the wound before transporting him to a clinic where a doctor administered antibiotics and sutured the deepest lacerations. Mateo survived with minimal lasting damage beyond scarring and a deep respect for the unpredictability of marine predators. Local authorities investigated the incident and concluded that the shark had likely been startled rather than actively hunting, noting that most hammerhead encounters with humans ended without injury. Tour operators in the area began briefing their clients more thoroughly about maintaining awareness during early morning paddles when shark activity peaked, emphasizing that even docile species could become defensive when surprised in confined spaces. August 3, 2023. The waters of Port Stephens on the New South Wales coast stretched beneath a cloudless winter sky, the offshore breeze building steadily as the morning progressed into early afternoon. This estuary system, located roughly 200 kilometers north of Sydney, had developed over millennia where the Mile and Karua rivers met the Tasman Sea, creating a complex network of channels, sandbars, and deep-water passages that supported an astonishing diversity of marine life. The area's sheltered bays made it popular among kiteboarding enthusiasts who appreciated the consistent winds and relatively calm conditions. Sienna Marlowe, a 29-year-old physiotherapist from Brisbane, had been kiteboarding for 5 years and had traveled to Port Stephens specifically for its reputation as one of Australia's premier kiteboarding destinations. She had arrived 3 days earlier with 2 friends, renting a small cottage near the water and spending each afternoon on the waves, testing new techniques and aerial maneuvers that pushed the limits of her skill level. The conditions on August 3rd were nearly perfect. The wind had picked up around 1 in the afternoon, blowing offshore at roughly 20 knots, strong enough to provide lift without becoming dangerously gusty. Sienna launched from Fingal Beach, her 12-meter kite snapping and pulling as she waded into waist-deep water before leaping onto her board. Within minutes, she was racing across the bay's entrance, her body leaning back against the kite's pull, spray kicking up from her board's edge. What neither Sienna nor her friends knew was that massive schools of mullet had been feeding near the surface throughout the morning, their silvery bodies churning the water as they moved in tight formations. The mullet runs were common during winter months, part of their annual migration pattern, but they inevitably attracted predators. Tiger sharks, in particular, followed these bait schools, opportunistically feeding on stragglers and injured fish that couldn't keep pace with the group. Sienna had been riding for roughly 40 minutes when she decided to attempt a more advanced trick, a backroll rotation that required precise timing and significant air. She positioned herself for the jump, accelerating across a smooth section of water before pulling hard on the control bar. The kite responded instantly, yanking her upward and off the surface. She was approximately 2 meters in the air, her body inverted mid-rotation, when the tiger shark struck. The 10-foot predator had been tracking her movements for the past several minutes, the erratic pattern of her board cutting through the water mimicking the distressed movements of injured prey. The shark launched itself partially out of the water, its jaws clamping onto Sienna's right calf as she hung suspended above the surface. The impact was devastating. Pain exploded through her leg as the serrated teeth punched through her wetsuit and into the muscle beneath. The shark's weight, combined with its momentum, pulled her violently downward even as the kite continued trying to lift her skyward. The opposing forces created a horrific tension, and Sienna screamed, the sound carrying across the water to her friends who were riding 50 meters away. The kite jerked wildly in the wind, responding to Sienna's loss of control, while the shark maintained its grip and thrashed its head. Blood poured from the wounds, spreading across the surface in dark ribbons. Sienna kicked desperately with her free leg, connecting with the shark's snout and gills, her survival instinct overriding the pain. Her friend Marcus, a carpenter from Melbourne who had been riding nearby, saw the attack and immediately released his kite, letting it fall into the water as he dove towards Sienna. Another friend, Phoebe, grabbed a rescue board they kept tethered to their support boat and began paddling frantically toward the scene. The tiger shark held on for perhaps 8 or 9 seconds before releasing its grip, apparently confused by the kite's pulling force and the unusual texture of the neoprene wetsuit. It descended rapidly, its distinctive vertical stripes visible beneath the surface as it swam in a tight circle before heading toward deeper water. The nearby mullet school had scattered during the commotion, and the shark followed their dispersing shadows rather than continuing its attack. Marcus reached Sienna within 30 seconds, grabbing her under the arms as she struggled to stay conscious. The pain was overwhelming, radiating from her calf up through her entire leg. Her kite had fallen into the water and was being dragged in the current, the lines tangled around her harness. Marcus worked quickly to release the safety mechanism, freeing her from the equipment before Phoebe arrived with the rescue board. Together, they hauled Sienna onto the board, her leg bleeding profusely from multiple deep puncture wounds, where the shark's teeth had penetrated. The scars were jagged and irregular, several teeth having torn through muscle as the shark thrashed. Phoebe applied direct pressure with her rash guard while Marcus paddled them toward their support boat, which their other friend Lachlan had already started moving toward them. They reached the boat within 3 minutes, and Lachlan helped pull Sienna aboard while maintaining pressure on the wounds. He radioed the Coast Guard, who dispatched a rescue helicopter from Newcastle. The aircraft arrived 18 minutes later, lowering a paramedic who administered pain medication and applied proper tourniquets before winching Sienna aboard. She was transported to a hospital in Newcastle, where surgeons worked for 4 hours to clean and repair the damage. The shark had severed several minor blood vessels and torn through significant muscle tissue, but had narrowly missed the major arteries. Sienna survived with permanent scarring and reduced mobility in her ankle, though doctors assured her that extensive physical therapy would restore most of her function. The incident prompted immediate discussion among local kiteboarding schools about safety protocols during mullet runs. Several operators began requiring spotters with rescue equipment for sessions during known migration periods, and warning signs were posted at popular launch sites about increased shark activity during winter months, when bait schools concentrated near shore. Marine experts emphasized that tiger sharks were opportunistic feeders, whose hunting instincts could be triggered by the high-speed, erratic movements of water sports equipment, particularly when combined with the presence of natural prey in the area. Sienna spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from the attack, undergoing additional procedures to prevent infection and ensure proper healing of the damaged tissue. Her parents flew down from Cairns to stay with her during the initial recovery period, and the psychological impact proved nearly as challenging as the physical injuries. She experienced recurring nightmares about being pulled underwater, and the sound of wind through trees would sometimes trigger anxiety attacks that reminded her of the kites flapping during those terrifying seconds. Physical therapy sessions began 3 weeks after the attack, focusing on rebuilding strength in her damaged calf muscles and restoring range of motion to her ankle joint. The therapists warned her that full recovery could take 6 months to a year, and she might never regain complete athletic function. Despite this, Sienna remained determined to return to the water eventually, though she admitted to friends that kiteboarding held less appeal than it once had. The attack also affected her friends Marcus, Phoebe, and Lachlan, all of whom struggled with guilt about not recognizing the dangers posed by the mullet school earlier that day. They had all noticed the baitfish but had not connected their presence to increased predator activity, a mistake they vowed never to repeat.